So this is our opportunity to talk about people on the move in search of meaning. Hold on, something's being handed to me. Thanks. And here the real concern is the question is, what is it? What is it about young people nowadays that feel like there's a hole to fill? They are feeling somehow estranged from the society in which they live, a little bit sort of unanchored, untethered, unsettled. And what we're seeing around the world is a simultaneous rise of, on the one hand, the Ku Klux Klan in this country, which has been growing over the past 15 years, and on the other hand, violent extremist groups such as ISIS. What is it about their appeal? How do we better understand it? And how do we as philanthropists in the room think about how to fill that hole in a very different way? So we're going to hear from Will McCants, who's at Brookings Institution. I'm not going to give long descriptions. Will was at the State Department and was a key advisor on this question. And I think what you all know by now is that Will literally wrote the book on ISIS. And so Pak YAHYA of Indonesia, from the NU party there, had opportunity and is now working in the United States and with the University of Vienna in Austria. And we'll be able to ask him a good deal about Indonesia, of course, the largest Muslim country in the world. And then finally, SHAMIL. SHAMIL runs something called Search for Common Ground, which is an organization that has done an enormous amount of good work in the world of conflict resolution, conflict prevention. And in a prior life, he, in some ways, invented the world of virtual exchanges, which he has brought in to Search for Common Ground as well. So just so that we can even understand the nature of the problem, SHAMIL, I'm going to start with you and ask you about the various myths out there about what is a motivation for joining these kinds of groups. What is it that we hear are the reasons and end up shaping our responses that turn out not to be so?
Great, thank you, Jane, very much. As a quick precursor to answering your question, I just wanted to explain a little bit about what I am and what I am not. So I'm not a scholar. I've got, like Will, or a religious scholar like YAHYA. I run an international nonprofit organization. So what I'll share with you today is drawn from our lessons learned from the local teams that we support and partners with whom we work in 36 different countries around the world, doing work at the local community level with youth groups, working in prison systems, working with governments to try to diversify their approaches to this issue so they're not just the sharp end of the spear, tough-ended approaches. So that's where the lessons are taken from. That and the field of virtual exchange, which briefly connects young adults across the US and Western Europe with their peers in Muslim-majority cultures, and we've learned a lot because you can engage young people that way that are outside the normal exchange experiences. So based on those experiences and also their limitations, first, what I think some of the myths are, there's not as much a correlation as people oftentimes posit between degree of religiosity and participation in extremist movements. You find oftentimes young people who join ISIS or join al-Nusra Front or any of these groups oftentimes convert 1 week and suddenly are off in Syria fighting, or they haven't had a history of being particularly religious or devout. So there's not as much of a correlation there as people might expect, which is not to say that there's not a theological base to some of ISIS's ideology and what they're trying to appeal to. There very much is. There's not as much of a correlation as people would anticipate and oftentimes posit between levels of poverty or joblessness and participation in these groups. I think Will offer a little bit of additional color to that, but in terms of a one-to-one existence, the more unemployment you have, the more participation you have in ISIS just doesn't hold true. And third, there's not as much of a correlation as people oftentimes posit between lack of education and participation in these groups, particularly among some of the leadership of these groups, which are oftentimes quite highly educated. it's a very dangerous space to make any generalizations, which is frustrating for a group like this, because generalizations are helpful in determining what are we going to do about it. So I'm going to make a couple generalizations with a massive caveat that, as I was reflecting by kind of the work that we do, local context is really everything. And what causes a young person in Maiduguri in northeastern Nigeria to join Boko Haram, and a Moroccan in El Hoceima in northern Morocco to run to Syria, or some young woman in Colorado to go, they're very different, very different. But if it's not primarily those three things, what is it? What we found, and I think some of the more credible research shows, is that some of the common factors are a sense of alienation, marginalization, humiliation, a sense of powerlessness in the face of perceived injustice. That these kinds of emotional experiences and somewhat you might call identity crises are much closer markers of the likelihood of a young person to look for belonging, as is the title of the session, in a violent extremist movement. And the last thing I'd point out on that, which makes it challenging but also gives us clues to how to address these issues, is it's not so different from what we've seen for decades drives the recruitment of young people into urban gangs, into child soldier movements, into drug cartels, and so we actually have a lot of lessons to learn and draw upon, and we don't have to think that everything has to be new because this has to do somehow with Islam, and maybe we don't know so much about Islam, some of us, and so we're feeling like, well, we had no clue then. No, we actually know a lot from these other settings, and there's a lot of lessons that are directly relevant to this issue.
And are some of the tools the same? That is to say, for example, there are various community groups that have been able to work with parents in the city of Los Angeles or someplace where there is gang violence to help them, help the parents, both see it coming, seeing that their child might be attracted, and to find ways to intervene and offer a different path.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you see with most of those movements, their starting point for any young person is, you're powerful, we need you. We have a just cause, whatever it is, and you are a driver of change and we need you. And too many of the efforts that are framed around countering violent extremism approach young people as, you poor young people, you're marginalized, you're alienated, you need our help. And it's not the most empowering thing. So the second thing that you see happening oftentimes is stuff that seeks to talk at young people doesn't go nearly as well as things that give young people a voice. You know, I was talking yesterday in a small group. I'll share it with the full group as well, just because I'll never forget it from that Michael Moore film, Bowling for Columbine, when, for those who saw it, he's trying to find out, well, why is there so much gun violence in America? Because you have an equal per capita gun ownership in a country like Canada or Switzerland, so what's going on here? And at one point, he's interviewing the heavy metal rocker Marilyn Manson, because the kids who shot up Columbine High School were fans of his music. And so there was some blowback against his music afterwards. And so Moore asked him, if you could talk to Dylan Klebold and the other boy who shot up the school the morning of the attack, what would you say to them? And Manson didn't miss a beat. He immediately said, I wouldn't say anything, I'd listen to them. That's what nobody did. And that, I think, is a profound lesson that groups that work with young people really need to heed. Providing avenues where young people can be heard and express themselves, talk about the things that upset them, and where the goal is not simply, let's keep this group from becoming violent, but it's actually, let's recognize young people for the powerful change makers that, in fact, they always have been across history and in almost every culture, and let's provide more constructive pathways for them to act out that, change-making passion.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to turn to you and narrow the aperture for a moment and focus in on ISIS in particular, because you've recently done a study on who is being attracted to ISIS, and to some degree why.
Sure. We just did a study. We were looking at the attack data we have since 2011, and also the data about people who have traveled from abroad to join ISIS, to try and give us a sense of what's really driving this movement. And in the beginning, I think you should make a distinction between two things in your head. One is what drives someone locally, say in Syria or Iraq, to join, And then what drives a foreigner to leave their family, leave their friends, travel abroad and join? Those are two different incentive structures that are driving those things. One has to do with reasons for joining an insurgency. If you're part of a war-torn country, there's usually an economic incentive involved, or you're doing it out of fear. You want to be with the guys, not against the guys that have the guns, those sorts of things. When you look at the foreigners, there's a different set of incentives. And some of this really comes out when you look at a combination of factors. There's usually not one thing that's driving people to join, but a series of things. And in the past, folks who've studied this have identified a few of them. One has to do, as SHAMIL says, with peer networks. If your peers join a militant underground organization, you're more likely to join up than not. So a lot of this has to do with peer pressure. Also in Europe, there is a countercultural aspect to this. I mean, nothing is more countercultural today than ISIS. So it is a rebellion against mainstream Muslim values in Europe, and it's a rebellion against mainstream Western values as well. And I think this is one reason why you find a lot of new converts that are joining. They don't particularly know the religious theology very well. They don't know the jurisprudence very well, but there's something exciting about rebelling in this way. You also have a lot of criminals who get involved. And one reason is, of course, they want to find some way to justify their criminality through religion, but there's another overlooked aspect, and that is, for many of them, this violence is redemptive. They feel guilty about their religious pasts. They feel that it's an opportunity to cleanse their sins in the eyes of God on the battlefield. But there are also some structural issues that are harder to get at. And the studies in this area have, by and large, been pretty weak because you are dealing with a small number of people. So it's always hard to derive big conclusions. But our study led us in some strange directions. And I will share it with you with the big caveat that some of this we don't understand for ourselves. And we actually sat on these results for months because we were too hesitant to share them in public. Some of them, you might suspect, has to do with youth unemployment and urbanization. But it's not a binary. It's not unemployment or not, urbanization or not. It matters if these things are in a certain range. And before or after that range, it doesn't seem to have any impact. So for youth unemployment, it was generally between 10 and 30%. Before that didn't matter, after didn't matter. Also urbanization, between 65 and 80%. When these two things interacted with each other, they tended to produce even more fighters than if these were separate. The third thing we found, though, that was driving a lot of the foreigners to travel abroad to fight was the reason that we were reticent to share it. And that had to do with the fact that it mattered a lot whether you came from a French-speaking country or not. And we initially didn't quite know what to make of it. We're still hesitant, but we think it has to do something with the way that French political culture handles secularism. In many countries that were influenced by the French colonial legacy, but also in France itself, secularism means removing symbols of religiosity. And we think that this may, in part, explain why French speaking was so correlated with driving foreigners. It didn't have anything to do with the language. It was a proxy for something else. But what was fascinating is these three factors working together in concert ended up explaining a lot more of the travel than otherwise.
So in essence, if you're saying you must not wear the veil, you're disrespecting their own value system and their own religion. It would be as though you said, you must not wear a cross or you must not wear a yarmulke. Is that, am I going
That's exactly
too far
right.
on
And
this?
the two countries in Western Europe that ban the wearing of the hijab in school are Belgium and France. And it's also the case that many of these networks emerge among areas of dense urban populations where there's a high level of youth employment as well. And I think that's one reason why we've seen this series of attacks over the last few months in France and Belgium in particular.
So I think you described, SHAMIL, a world that sounds very much like adolescence, period, right? That sense of not knowing your own place, feeling powerless, feeling humiliated. Where I wanted to take us, Will, for a moment is to where there may be actual grievances. I'm not saying that this would ever justify violence, but where you have sort of overlaid over that emotional unease that so many young people have right now, and not only young people, but so many people have right now, if you have an overlay of a sense of real injustice. Yesterday when I was talking to Chris Stone, I reminded him this was not the first refugee crisis in Europe involving Muslims, right? So we had thousands of Muslims murdered, men and boys, and another 25,000 expelled from Bosnia and back in the 90s. Both Europe and the US were very slow to act.
That's right. And that's one of the major drivers, young people to go travel abroad. And the obvious one that often gets unsaid is the fact that they are reacting to large-scale suffering of their co-religionists. I mean, if you ask foreign fighters who are transiting into Syria, they would answer the same way foreign fighters would have answered back in the 90s with what was happening in Bosnia. They feel that the international community had abandoned their co-religionists and they were going there to defend them.
And SHAMIL, are we hearing any of that from former recruits who have since renounced violent extremism?
Yeah, but more so even than that, the sort of lack of the international community to respond to certain crises. It's sort of the view that more than that, there is an aggressive assault on Muslim countries and Muslim cultures driven by the West. And that narrative, when I was at the UN, and we would see that narrative very powerfully articulated in lots of different ways, that as decolonization happened across the African continent, for instance, in the 60s, colonization increased in Muslim societies, that as Western troops and forces left all these other regions, Latin America and elsewhere, they invaded again and again Muslim countries to secure oil, to maintain a certain autocracy and power or whatever else might be. So we're hearing that grievance around, hey, there hasn't been the same kind of responsiveness when there's an attack in Paris and there's an attack in Beirut on the same week. All the world's leaders descend on Paris and they march in the streets and nobody pays any attention to Beirut. So you hear that. But the other thing that you hear is, no, it's more than that. There's actually a proactive assault. And it's a difficult narrative for people to engage with because when you look at issues like troops on the ground, invasions of countries across the Arab world or whatever, it's a very powerful, it's quite easy to tell that narrative and to tell it very emotionally, to tell it with sufficient statistics and lots of visuals, and it's powerful.
But to be clear, do you argue that these are causes or these are overlays and justifications and...
It's funny, I almost don't think it matters. I mean, if I had this conversation when Bin Laden, before ISIS, when Bin Laden would say, I saw the towers in Beirut coming down by the American-supplied Israeli war jets, and I had the idea of bringing the American Twin Towers down. Okay, so when he says that, whether that was actually his motivation or was just something he knew would speak to a lot of people, the real issue is, well, that speaks to a lot of people, right? So I don't want to get into, well, are people genuinely upset about this, or are they using it cynically to recruit people to a movement that has other purposes? The point is, it resonates very powerfully, that narrative.
So, Pak YAHYA, it's striking to me that Indonesia, or when Will looks at the various sources of both local fighters and foreign fighters, Indonesia is not on the list. Why are so few people Indonesians being attracted to jihad?
First, thank you, Jane Wills, for bringing me here. It's a great honor. It's a tremendous opportunity to learn, meeting so many knowledgeable people in many different fields. Well, what I would want to say is that Islam is not monolithic. is heterogeneous. There are several different streams of theology, different interpretations on Islam, as variant interpretation on Islam that grows and established to be traditions. And if I would give a picture that there are two ways for Muslim to see Islam. First is Islam, a religion that is meant to alter the world, meant to substitute the reality, the existing reality of the world, or Islam as a contribution to the existing civilizational history of humanity. That is the basic view of the way Muslims see their religion. In Indonesia, we have a vast majority of Muslims. We have 85 to 90% of Muslim Indonesia. That means more than 220 million Muslim in Indonesia. But when the founding fathers of our state established Indonesia, they established it not as an Islamic state, but a pluralistic, secular state. So this has something to do with the tradition of Islam, the variant interpretation on Islam that has been dominant in Indonesia. Because in a huge population of Muslim like Indonesia, you can see more easily the relation between the different way of viewing Islam among the Muslims themselves, and the orientation of their way to manifest Islam. So, because in Indonesia we have like all the spectrum of Islamic tradition we have there. So that if you ask about where these people who join the extremist movement come from, in Indonesia you can easily see a constant, domain of the tradition of the variant interpretation on Islam. But what we have to be the dominant variant interpretation of Islam in Indonesia is the tradition that see Islam as the contribution to the existing civilizational heritage that we have in Indonesia. That makes Indonesian Muslim have more sense of belonging to their indigenous culture and civilizational heritage, and then prevent them from the appeal from being lured by the appeal of extremist propaganda. But there are people that indeed vulnerable to the appeal of extremist propaganda. In Indonesia, their view, because we, the majority of Muslim in Indonesia, we intentionally strive and build mechanism to block the influence of this extremist propaganda in Indonesia. So, but we see that in the last few decades, the threat of radicalism, the propaganda of radicalism and extremism in Indonesia has been getting stronger because there is a global source that support the propaganda. So what we are thinking now is we need a global strive to deal with it globally.
What's interesting is picking up Queen Sylvia's theme is that notion of belonging to your traditional culture. But another thing about the work you do is that you encourage that sense of belonging to nation. There's a sense of nationhood, culture, and faith, and allowing them to be aligned. Will, I wanted to take you to that sense of nationhood for a moment, because one of your findings that you shared with me earlier was that it was easier to recruit from states that were not competent, states that were not providing reliable services. And I know on the other hand, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, they're offering services as well as an ideology. Give us a sense of both that finding, but also the appeal, ISIS's unique appeal in offering a homeland, which makes it quite different from Al-Qaeda and other such groups.
Sure. Yeah, so I have to say this finding was also frustrating for me because my own bias cuts against these economic or structural explanations for jihadist violence. I tend to dismiss them out of hand, but it was hard to ignore that when you looked at rates of electricity provision, infant mortality rates, and you matched them against the attack data and the production of foreign fighters, more often than not, countries that were better at service provision had lower rates of radicalizations, right? So was sort of an average across all the countries, so we were interested in the ones that were above average or below average. And the ones that were below average, many of them were better at service provision. And it had nothing to do with the type of government. It didn't matter if it was authoritarian or democratic. What mattered was government service provision. So there seems to be a strong relationship between the two. For the Islamic State, and part of its unique appeal in contrast to Al-Qaeda, and one reason it's attracted so many people, is that it is holding itself out not just as a homeland for other Sunni Muslims, but as the return of God's kingdom on earth. They are unique among jihadist groups in claiming to have reestablished the ancient Islamic empire, and they also teach that the world is coming to an end soon after its establishment. And for many foreigners that are attracted to the group, not the locals, but for the foreigners, it is a powerful recruiting pitch. And SHAMIL is totally right. A lot of these people that go there, they don't know Islamic history or theology very well, but it's the religious vision that is very inspiring, and the opportunity for many, not just in Europe, but in parts of the Middle East and North Africa, to participate in a state-building enterprise, to have a say in how they are to be governed, I think taps into something pretty deep, not just in what motivates a youth to activism, but also a youth living in the Middle East who may have finished high school or college and doesn't have a lot of opportunities locally. Some of them will go fight for the Islamic State, and even if they don't go fight, they express admiration intermingled with disdain for the Islamic State because they have been able to, by force of arms and will, to establish a state, defying the international community and also defying the local authoritarians in the neighborhood.
So We've identified 3 problems. One is disaffected youth. Another is Islamism, the combination of politics with an interpretation of the faith. And the third, which we haven't talked about, but I'm sure we will, is social media. So I want to look at the 3 problems and see how they can be flipped into solutions. So I'm going to start, Shamil, with you. What is the role and the potential role of young people in addressing some of these dangers and in helping one another?
Yeah, I mean, separate from this particular issue, young people have a particular association with violence that's just deeply troubling. That's the leading cause of death for young people globally between the ages of 15 and 29. And young people are oftentimes disproportionately engaged either by being induced or being forced to participate as perpetrators of violence. And so we have what I think is not an overly idealistic. I think it's grounded in absolute reality and reams of evidence that young people are the primary drivers of social change. Older people oftentimes get the Nobel Prizes, but oftentimes the movements start on whether it's college campuses or youth groups, and so young people have a tremendous role to play. The myth or the promise of interactive media for someone like me who believes in the importance of cross-cultural engagement, peace building, this kind of thing, is really, it's the best time in history to be alive. More and more people every week are able to communicate with one another, and that's just going to grow more and more. Fantastic. The way this is playing out as we are in this global transitional period of incredible disruption, though, is that oftentimes, though, with new media technologies, we can, for instance, subscribe to lots of different sources of information. A lot of us will choose those sources of information that reinforce our pre-existing worldviews. So the follower of CNN and Fox are living in 2 totally different worlds, let alone Al Jazeera or whatever. And similarly, though, we can have social networks that will bridge all kinds of differences. You don't see a lot of social networks that actually bridge the religious and the secular, the conservative and the liberal. And I think this is not an issue of Islam or violent extremism. This is just an issue of what's going on as the world adapts to all these new technologies that are evolving much faster than our, frankly, political will or human maturity to use them to the best of our abilities. So coming back to the positive, we reference this field of virtual exchange. The basic concept of virtual exchange, as an example, is one of the best ways to open up people's minds and perspectives is to support them to study abroad or go on an exchange program. That's unfortunately an experience that is really only taken advantage of or accessible to less than 1% of the global youth populations. And the plurality of young people who participate on those go on exchanges between the US and Western Europe. So we're not exactly bridging our biggest cultural divides. And so the notion of virtual exchanges is it takes the scalable reach of new media technologies and these interactive platforms, and it says, hey, if we integrate with those pedagogy for deep cross-cultural engagement and learning, which we know really well. We know how you can enable an interaction that allows for really profound cross-cultural engagement. Then you can have something special. And what we've seen in the programming that we've done for more than 11 years now, virtual exchanges across these divides, where every single semester, these programs that engage young Americans and Europeans with their peers in Muslim-majority countries, every semester at least one student in a Muslim-majority country complains to his teacher found out that one of the kids in his group is Jewish, and what does that mean? Is Israel tracking our conversations? And at least one of the kids in the US or Western Europe says, I don't think violent Islamism is a fringe thing. I think your religion is inherently violent. And these things get said that in a chat room would lead to a nasty, all-out flame war, in a facilitated environment actually play out to have extraordinary educational impact on young people. And so that is one example of what I think we need to do, which is to use the extraordinary potential of these technologies and platforms to actually improve cross-cultural understanding, cross-cultural empathy, and cooperation. But they won't, it's not a kind of, if you build it, they will come. They have to be imbued. The critical component of that programming I just mentioned to you is not the technical platform. It's important that it's a good one, but it's the facilitation. To facilitate that program for us, you need to go through 28 hours of highly intensive training and mentorship, because we're not trying to engage young people to have easy conversations. We're actually trying to create a safe space for young people to have very difficult conversations. And one of the things that we found that's really powerful in the MIT lab that does the evaluations for us, it's a neuroscience lab that I'll just share as a profound learning from this, is the experience for young people of being agreed with is actually irrelevant. It's not the important threshold for a young person to go through in order to open up their mind to other perspectives, or even to engage in some self-critical thought, or to consider the possibility that their community too is contributing to some of the negative things going on in the world. The critical threshold for them to pass is having the experience of being heard and respected. This goes back to the Marilyn Manson quote. And what we found is when a young person says in these groups, and it happens every semester, I think the 9/11 attacks were fabricated. I think the government of the US and Israel committed them. When that's said, and in some groups we've had people whose parent died in the 9/11 attacks or whatever it might be. But when that's said, and that young person doesn't have the experience they're expecting of being shut down or yelled at, nobody agrees with them in the group, or oftentimes nobody agrees, but they're engaged with, why do you think that? What experiences have you had? Where are you coming from on that? It's incredible how they then move past that space. And similarly for the non-Muslims who say all kinds of things about the Muslim world that are patently false, but it's what they believe. So I think there's a lot of power, tremendous untapped power in the use of new media technologies and social media. And the nice last thing I'll say on virtual exchange is last year in February, President Obama announced the first dedicated fund for virtual exchanges that 4 Arab governments, the US government, and the Bezos Foundation have now vested with over $70 million in support. This will allow the largest increase in people-to-people education, cross-cultural education and exchange in history between the US and Muslim-majority countries. So,
you said earlier, you spoke earlier to the importance of voice as well as this actual interaction, actually meeting one another, getting to know the other. You've used radio shows, et cetera, in war zones. I know that there's a lot of funding within the United States for those kinds of shows in inner city situations, for inner city kids to be able to be their own spokespeople and interviewers of one another. Mention a couple of the examples that you've been part of, and then I'm going to turn back to Will.
One of the more powerful ones is the story of Stephen Swanky, who's a Sierra Leonean kid. I went to visit our programming in Sierra Leone. We had a team, long-standing Sierra Leonean team there, and Stephen was 14 when he started showing up at some of our events and trainings. And he didn't say anything for 8 months. He would come, we were very open, our team there was very open. And so I came and I saw this kid over there, and I went to our team, I said, who is that guy? He hasn't said anything, he was here the whole time, then he just left, he didn't participate. He's been coming regularly, and we've reached out to him, and we let him know he's welcome. Long story short, it eventually came out that Stephen had been a child soldier. He'd gone through the UN-run decommissioning process, turned in his weapons, and he was pretty lost. And it took him that long, and this is something with the demobilization, de-radicalization field I think is really important to understand. Oftentimes, people's whole frameworks have been deconstructed the way a cult would deconstruct it, and when they come back, it takes time. Anyway, Stephen became one of the most extraordinary peace-building leaders in Sierra Leone, and we eventually got him his own, we ran a radio studio called Talking Drum Studio. Stephen hosted, when he was, by the age he was 15, one of the most powerful programs in Sierra Leone that was geared towards his fellow former fighters in the bush about what it was like to come out, what challenges you face, what was there to support you. He directly aided in the demobilization of tens of thousands of young child soldiers in Sierra Leone. That kind of thing is possible, but it takes patience, long-term commitment. It takes listening to the person, not forcing them to talk before they're ready. It just takes, you know, and so there's a lot of opportunity in this space, but very powerful effect, but it's not a quick fix.
Not a quick fix. Well, we often associate these groups with social media, digital media, with some of the most sophisticated means of communication. Shamil's talking about radio. We heard in an earlier panel about a megaphone atop a bicycle. Is ISIS all about digital media, or is there some more basic forms of communication?
No, that's what the media tends to focus on, because of course it's the easiest to access. But some of their most effective media and their outreach, their propaganda is pretty low tech. The most effective piece of propaganda they have is actually a news magazine. They distribute it online, but they also distribute it face to face. And it's effective because they explain where they are attacking, why they are attacking. They give personal stories to illustrate the struggle and the need for more youth to be involved. But one of the most effective techniques that ISIS has at recruiting is not broadcasting big messages. It is one-to-one recruitment. And this either happens through social media on direct message, or it happens in person. And as I said earlier, peer networks are extremely important in getting someone involved in radicalization. And they use those networks to tap into people back home and to bring them to fight in these various fronts. The interventions that I have seen that have been the most effective follow the same playbook. They develop one-to-one relationships with people who have been radicalized, and through patient dialogue over weeks or even years, they start to break down this worldview, as SHAMIL said, that is pretty comprehensive, and it takes a long time to chip away at it. It is very resource intensive. It would be tough to mount a full-scale effort. But we are not talking about hundreds of thousands of people who've been radicalized either. The number is not that big. It's a manageable endeavor, but it just requires putting money against it. And it's difficult for a government to mobilize in this way because, one, the government's bias is always towards big messaging campaigns that everybody can see, not these one-to-one things. And also, at least in the United States, it's very difficult for U.S. employees to talk to active supporters of terrorist organizations. You run up against some laws pretty quickly. So this is the kind of endeavor that is, one, incredibly effective, but two, is resource intensive and hard for the government to do.
And in the case, YAHYA, of your efforts, I think what's one of the interesting things about it is that your fundamental message is one of political pluralism, the basis for governance. Talk about how you try to get that message out, and then we'll turn to the audience.
Thank you. Yeah, we are working with our government, but the message that we work with the government to convey is to not politicize Islam, not use as a symbolical trick on Islam to use it for political purpose. Because when you do that, you use religion as the fundamental argument for political purpose, then everything is absolute and no space for dialogue because its religion is absolute. But then joining extremist group is a choice of mode of action. It's a mode of action that people choose. But the religious view that the extremist group has actually shared broader beyond the group itself. So there are people that not yet join extremist group, but share the very same religious value that the extremist group has. These are people who are vulnerable to the appeal of extremist campaign. In Indonesia, for example, we have people, Muslim people, that has way much worse public service for them, provided for them, worse than what the worst area in Europe, for example. But yet they are in Indonesia, these people, they are immune to the extremist campaign because they have this religious view that shape their worldview that's, naturally reject the extremist campaign, extremist messages. So this is what we are working with our government to strengthen. That is to acknowledge, to embrace our own indigenous culture and civilizational heritage. That's the first point of our campaign. And the second, to encourage the nation, including the government, to take claim of legitimacy of our Islam. That Islam that we have as tradition in Indonesia and its unique manifestation is legitimate. It's unique and it's Islamic, it's authoritative. So that as a largest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia should take the claim for the right to contribute in determining the face of the whole Islamic world. And this sense of belonging is the things that we want to share globally to any Muslim communities in other places to attach themselves to their local, cultural, and social environment and embrace it and see Islam as the contribution, not to replace, not to conquer, not to dominate, but just to contribute to what that the society already have.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up for others, so please raise your hand and the mic runners will come to you. I have to trust that the mic, okay, over here.
This is a question for SHAMIL. I'm sorry, I came in a little bit mid. I might have missed the description of the virtual exchange. Can you talk a little bit about how that works? How people engage on either side of the virtual exchange you described?
Yeah, so the particular program that we run focuses on higher education students, but there are virtual exchange programs run by excellent organizations like Global Nomads Group and others that work at high school level and others. The way our particular program works, very briefly, is it gets integrated into college courses, but importantly, not just sort of, it's integrated into the Ivy Leagues and into the elite American University of Cairo, American University of Kuwait, et cetera, but it's also integrated into community colleges where more than half of American higher education students go, and it's integrated into public universities in rural Egypt, in Minufia, where there have been 2 exchange students in 10 years, and there's a waiting list of hundreds for our program. So it gets integrated into a variety of, and it works this way. It's run over 8 weeks. You are scheduled as a student into a group that is specifically kind of geared to put you with half of the group between 8 and 10 young people, half from Muslim-majority countries, half from the US and Western Europe. You meet once, none of them are from your university. Usually none of them are from your country. So you're really, you're an individual in that space. And it meets for 8 weeks, 2 hours a week with the same group. And the facilitator really works through a very basic learning arc that that any cross-cultural education program would do. You don't start with, hey, what do you think of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? You start with, think of 3 elements of your identity that are really key to who you are, and then drop 2 of them, keep 1 of them, share the one with the group, and why did you choose that one today? And it might be because you're a fan of a particular soccer team, or it might be your faith, it might be the fact that you have 3 brothers and a sister, whatever. So the groups bond on a personal, human level throughout the whole first session and a half. And then the topics of the discussions are really largely left up to the group to determine. And they tend to gravitate towards a subset of issues. They almost always get into the issues of women's role in society. They want to talk about foreign policy, particularly American foreign policy and their views on it. They talk about the intersection of religion and politics in your country and my country. And they talk about questions I always had about you, but I was afraid to ask, kind of stuff. So that's the way it works. I can tell you more about it offline, but we've seen really extraordinary leaps in 2 spaces: in cross-cultural empathy, as measured with this really cool tool that MIT developed on self-other overlap, they call it, and cross-cultural communication and collaboration skills. And the excitement for us, forget our program, the fact that there's now a dedicated field for this, a dedicated fund for this field, we are hoping will lead to the same explosion of that field that the Fulbright program enabled for cross-cultural exchange generally. Because we think this is one of the only truly scalable means of people-to-people education that we know of.
If others in the audience, there's a hand over there, if others in the audience know of great examples in which voice is given to young people so that they can be the source of the connection, we'd love to hear about them. Yes, sir.
Aleem Walji from the Aga Khan Foundation. One of the things that I think is missing from the conversation is geopolitics, right? So I was very intrigued to hear the example from Indonesia, that this is a articulation of the faith, which you called authoritative, but which is blatantly non-exclusivist, right? It is inclusive, it is pluralistic, it is open, it is heterogeneous, right? That is patently counter to the Islam which is espoused by many of the countries in the world that have oil, that have for decades been helping to, sort of underwrite an Islam which is exclusivist and that is violent and which is non-tolerant. That's not part of this conversation at all, right? And it is a significant factor, right? So in as much as it's important to distinguish between what recruits a youth that lives in the region, who may have multiple reasons why they want to join or not join ISIS, and those that are in Western Europe, and I think some of the factors, Will, that you articulated are very interesting, but there's a whole nother overlay here, which is just absent from the conversation, which is that in the region, many people join these movements because they are against their co-religionists of a different interpretation, right? And to be very unpopular and sort of incorrect from a political sense, the greatest allies of the United States are the very countries that are espousing this exclusivist articulation of Islam.
So, Will, I'm going to ask you about Wahhabism, and because that's what the reference is to, and whether you're seeing a changed strategy on the part of Saudi Arabia. But then secondly, ask you, are you seeing political pluralism in the Levant?
Am I seeing it? No. Okay.
Is there any history of pluralism?
Right. Well, there certainly used to be. I mean, if you look at the region back in the 1950s or 1960s, there's almost an air of nostalgia about it, because at least among the elite, it was much more cosmopolitan than it is today. I think throughout the Middle East and North Africa, it's just become much more religiously conservative. I take your point, absolutely. And in fact, it's a book project that I'm beginning to look at the influence of ultra-conservative religious identity on politics, not just on violence, but on politics. I have my own assumptions about it, just as you do. I think it has a negative effect because it draws these sharp lines between us and the other. But I'm also cautious because some of the countries that espouse this kind of religious identity don't produce as many fighters per capita Muslim as countries with a more inclusive political ideology. So I don't want to rule it out, but I'm not convinced that it's the case that this is a necessary and sufficient explanation for why there is violence. I think the religious identity piece of it is important, but I don't think it tells us as much as we would like it to. I mean, there is no question that groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or other Salafi jihadi groups share the same religious creed as that found in Saudi Arabia. But they have a very different politics. Saudi politics, since the early 20th century, took on a very quietist flavor driven largely by the monarchy. That's different than the kind of politics espoused by the jihadists. So I take your point, and I think it's worth more investigation, but I am not certain that the causal line is as strong as you want to draw it.
Let's talk about something that's referred to in this country as soft power. Since you were on geopolitics, are we projecting in an effective way our own soft power? And when I say that, I don't limit myself, obviously, to government, because soft power is a part of the way all of society is expressing itself and putting forth an image. At least our self-image is one of tolerance, of inclusiveness, of pluralism, of acceptance. How are we doing on the soft power line?
I don't think very well. I mean, if you work at least on this issue in government, it is overwhelmed with security concerns. Any talk about outreach to communities, particularly Muslim community, that is separated from counterterrorism concerns, is quickly pushed to the back. I'm mindful of the fact when the Obama administration came in, they were very keen to separate the security discussion from the outreach discussion. And they had an office for outreach to Muslims, which I think Shannon's here somewhere, is global, what was it called? Global exchange, global something. But anyway, the point was to reach out to Muslims outside of this security framework. It has been shrunk gradually, and this global engagement, that's what it was called, global engagement has now again become synonymous with counterterrorism, and the two are once again inextricably tied to one another. So there is a lot of room for a soft power approach, but it quickly becomes overwhelmed with security concerns.
So Shamil, soft power is as much a function of what Hollywood produces, what Silicon Valley produces by way of games. You know, there are many ways that we express our value system. How are we doing?
I mean, I think a lot of people are aware that oftentimes it's sort of the worst of popular culture that spreads fastest, not always, but the most violent, the most titillating, the most, you know. I was in Saudi Arabia 2 weeks ago. The first question I gave this whole talk about something that had nothing to do with this, and the first question was, what in the world's going on with Donald Trump, and basically what's wrong with you people? Picking up on the statements about Muslim populations and all this. So people will be looking for and will oftentimes amplify the most troubling aspects of American culture and American politics. The U.S. could be doing a lot better, but there's there are incredible resources, I think, for this. The world, part of what's going on, and I think the topic of this whole conference, which I think is very powerful and timely, is incredible disruption. All the movement Chris Stone talked about in his opening talk, whether it's voluntary or it's forced, you mentioned it, disruption, which is largely being driven by this neighborhood right here in Silicon Valley and right around here, is having a really profound effect on every industry. And one of the concerns that I have is it's very attractive to people in one way, innovation, creativity, reimagining, but the whole notion of sort of adapt or die is great for a product line. It's not great for communities or livelihoods. And people are experiencing this disruption. I think the vast majority of populations actually are experiencing it in a very threatening way. So what can we do about it? I think that Philanthropy is actually crucial in this space because governments are so hamstrung with what they can do, and even if they had a good idea to do something, just the fact that they're governments, whether Western or otherwise, immediately delegitimizes it. So, you know, Alim from Icon Development Network, this is a group that's been around for decades, has centuries-long perspectives on what they're doing, engaged in Muslim societies. Cure of Violence is here in Gary, that's been working long before violent extremism became a popular thing in international circles with gangs. There are organizations that are Mercy Corps here. There are lots of great this gentleman represents a movement, is on the board of a movement that has tens of millions of members, tens of millions. These are, to me, these are all elements. You wouldn't call yourself an American. This is soft power in a way that's that global citizens need it, not necessarily as the American government or any particular government wants it. And there's a lot of hope in that space, and there's a lot of opportunity in that space. And private philanthropy is actually the best investor in that kind of thing, much more so than governments.
I just want to close with a couple of thoughts. And the first is, Shamil's absolutely right. This room is filled with people who offer soft power. If the image of us is Amy Rao, I'd be a very happy person with that alone. But both what you do and say, the choices you've made, and the organizations you support, that's what's persuasive. And that's what gives others a chance to belong and have voice. I want to just note some of the deficits, though, that are out there in this world from a philanthropic standpoint. And one is the reason we've invited Will McCants, and we've invited Karen Von Hippel, and we've invited Sharon Green, and we've invited all these individuals who are scholars as well as practitioners in this world, is that there is a lack of knowledge. More of what they do is what we need. So the kinds of surveys and studies that Will does are enormously important because they will influence our choices. The fact of myths to be debunked, a lot of energy is going into things that are just not so, just because we don't know better. So that combination of the generation of knowledge, the support for smart action in which voice is given, the connection to culture, to deep culture and heritage, and finally, a connection to our core and expression of our core values. So I don't want to preach, but I do want to thank this panel because it represents all of the above. Voice, true values, knowledge. So thank you.